Ladies and gentlemen, let's gaming Tegra video. Let us do further analysis of the recently announced by Nvidia Tegra K1. We're going to be taking a look at the architecture and technical analysis of both the CPU and the GPU. And I've also done an article with this, which of course shows off various technical slides, has links to, for example, Nvidia's white paper, which has tons more information and so on and so on. So if you guys want to check that out, well, you are more than welcome to. So anyway, this is a follow-up to the announcement video which I made, which actually got some controversy because people weren't really sure what they were expecting. I mean, there was a lot of controversy regarding, will we really be seeing graphics which beat the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360? And we're going to go into that as well. So, before we really jump in, I'm going to give you guys a very brief overview. There are two CPU variants. We'll delve into those in just a moment into real detail, but for now let's just give the basics. The first is an ARM Quad-Core Cortex A15, and the second involves a dual CPU. It's 64-bit and is known as Denver, and that's actually a custom-built solution from Nvidia themselves. Now, in terms of the GPU, it's actually using a version of the Kepler. That's how come it's called the K. Indeed, the CEO of Nvidia actually stated that calling this Tegra 5 wouldn't be justification of the performance jump between the previous Tegra 4, and the K1. And so they decided to call it K for the Kepler architecture. Now, because it's Kepler architecture, it does indeed include things such as OpenGL 4.4, DX11, OpenGL ES3, as well as things such as CUDA and hardware physics. Fortunately, as it turns out, the power requirements of the whole device in terms of the Kepler architecture are actually fairly low to begin with. And Nvidia have actually already got certain technologies and have implemented further technologies to further improve this. Technologies such as color compression, early Z culling, primitive culling are there for the purposes of improving the performance of the chip as well as reducing the bandwidth requirements. Now, we will go into the bandwidth in just a moment, but the basic premise here is that if you can either compress it, not need to render it, or basically optimize it, then doing so gives more performance, yeah? If you're not needing to, say, waste cycles or performance on rendering something that's not even going to be seen, then why send that data down the why process the data or even send it from the memory? It's just a waste of time. So the basic GPU, and we're going to discuss that before we go too much into the CPU, the basic GPU of this thing is 192 CUDA cores, and that makes up one SMX. Now, SMX stands for Nvidia's Streaming Multi Processor. So there's 192 of these CUDA cores, which makes just one SMX. So that sounds pretty low, because when you take something along the lines of Nvidia's own GTX 780 Ti, which features just under 3,000 CUDA cores, 2,880 to be precise, it sounds minuscule. Yeah, you'll just say to yourself, well, what's this crap? But it's extremely unfair to actually think of it like that. For a start, if you look at the GTX 780 Ti, you've got to remember that that GPU is built with 4K gaming often in mind. You can do something along the lines of run, say, 3 1080p screens if you so wish. In other words, it's a really high powered device, and obviously there are some other processors from Nvidia which have 2000 or 1000, but it's still an impressive number for the mobile, 192. Fortunately, it also features a large level 2 cache. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One, bandwidth is at a premium on mobile devices, or it has been, mostly because of power. And secondly, it reduces the power consumption, because if the chip's just using its own level 2 cache, then it doesn't need to farm requests out to the memory, the main system RAM. And so what happens is you're effectively saving power. Now, the larger the cache is, which is 128K, just to reiterate, the better the hit rate is. Now, hit rate, and this is a very simplified version, but the basic premise is that the larger the cache, the more data that can be held in that cache. And so the more data that can be held, the better the chance is that you're going to find the data you're looking for. The chip's going to find the data it's looking for when it goes there. If it doesn't, then it will farm out the request to memory. So it's almost like going to a small library and saying, well, okay, they don't have the book that I'm looking for, and then you go to the big library, say in your town, and oh, okay, now they've got the book, because obviously a lot larger, therefore they can store more things. Pretty simple. Now, in terms of ROPs, it features 4 ROPs with 8 texture units. The good news is that the GPU isn't crippled with things such as tessellation, geometry engines, the FP64 is still there, and so on and so on. So the real major change is actually power, right? So I did mention earlier that the Kepler architecture is already pretty good when it comes to power requirements. The thing is that they've basically reduced the ability for the chip to communicate with other SMXs. On a full Nvidia board, let's take, for example, I don't know, any of the high-end GeForce ranges, it doesn't matter which. You might have, well, you're going to have several of these SMXs, which means you're going to have hundreds of CUDA cores rather than just 192. You might have, say, 1,000, 2,000, or whatever. Now, how these operate is they all need to communicate with one another, right? Because obviously you can't process anything unless all the data is shared, which means all the ROPs need to speak to one another, the memory all needs to communicate, and so on and so on. I'm obviously oversimplifying this a little bit, but still. So the purpose behind this is they've basically removed a lot of this stuff from the die. It's no longer there. The reason is because pretty much it's not really gonna happen putting, say, 2 or 3, at the moment anyway, of these on to the same GPU. There's multiple reasons behind that, primarily die size and heat, and, well, power. You know, a mobile battery at the end of the day can only power a certain amount of things, because there's wattage requirements. In other words, the bigger the battery, well, yeah, the bigger the battery that you're porting, the less portable the device is. And therefore, obviously, we've got limits on battery technology right now. So that's basically the end of it. So obviously, this being a Kepler architecture, it does indeed support all of the relevant juicy things as we've discussed, like DX and so on. So what about the CPUs? Well, there's a couple of options. The first is an quad-core ARM Cortex A15, and this basically features 5 CPU cores, but 4 run when there's heavy performance. We'll go into that more in a moment. And there's a 5th core. Nvidia likes to call this a companion core or shadow core, whatever. The terms are basically interchangeable. And that's activated when there's not much going on. So let's assume that you're downloading a game, you're just chilling, the system goes on standby, you know, maybe it's reading Facebook messages or whatever the hell it's doing, it doesn't matter. That's what the CPU is that's taking over. There's nothing strenuous going on, therefore one of the 4 cores is just not required. So what instead happens if you're ramping up the requirements is the main cores are turned on. Now these activate sequentially. They're 32-bit, so let's assume that you're starting with core 1 to 4. Well, if you're running an application and core 1 is like, okay, can't do this by myself, core 2 will activate core 3 and then core 4. Core 5 will never activate, as far as I understand it, with this technology. It's just not there to do that. It's basically there just to be a low power standby type of solution rather than a main solution. So what will happen is this actually runs at 2.3 gigahertz and has a reasonable amount of memory. It's using, as far as I understand, the LPDDR3 64-bit. And we'll go into the bandwidth and so on in just a moment. And this memory is basically going to feed the GPU and the CPU. So I'm sure some of you might have heard of the term or code name Project Denver. Well, you probably heard of it about 10 minutes ago when I first started this, but whatever. It was originally teased way back in the mists, in the dawn of time, also known as 2011. And there hasn't really been that much confirmation from Nvidia yet. Nvidia, whatever you want to pronounce it. I always call them Nvidia, which is probably wrong, but you know, I know it's Nvidia, you always hear it on the start of games, but as I said, I've been calling him Nvidia for God knows how many years, so anyway, it's a hard habit to break. So anyway, despite a few words here and there hasn't really been that much information on it. We do know, from what Nvidia have said, that the two SoCs, system on chips, are pin compatible. In other words, they are pretty much 100% compatible with one another. If you could basically fit one onto the same socket as the other. There's no confirmation on memory, none at all. They haven't said that for the dual-core Denver. It's likely, because it's pin compatible, that we're going to be looking at the same LPDDR3. Once again, 64. Likely and is are two completely different beasts, but until I hear otherwise, that's what I'm going to assume. So, immediately, many of you are going to say, well, okay, so what? Is the dual-core the lower-end model? You know, what's going on there? Is it the cheaper one? You know, am I going to be saving $50, $100 if I go with this? Whatever. Well, actually, it's a little bit different. No need to scoff. The basic premise is that Nvidia are dubbing this a supercore. It's a design that they have created, but the difference is that you're only getting 2 cores, but you get much higher IPC, instructions per clock, in other words, how many things the CPU can do at a given frequency. And as I said, it runs at a higher clock speed as well as the higher IPC compared to the Quad. It'll also be 64 bits, 7-way superscalar, and runs at 2.5 GHz, so it's around 200 MHz faster. Obviously, a lot of this stuff depends on multiple factors, but whatever. And will also support 128K of instruction with an additional 64 of data. Now, a lot of the information on exactly how and why and when the CPU is running, in other words, a lot of the details are still somewhat a mystery. They haven't confirmed some of the stuff. The basic theory is that the x86 assembly is basically converted internally to the CPU's own format before it reaches the actual core, but NV have simply not 100% confirmed a lot of this stuff. The basic theory behind a lot of this is it's to do with the x86 license, but once again, it's not been confirmed, so I don't want to speak too much about idle speculation in this particular video. I'd rather focus on giving you guys like hard facts. Anyway, so this is the one that's gonna probably be the one that ruffles some feathers. Is it faster than the Xbox 360 or PS3? Well, this is a metric that's very difficult to quantify. In raw G-flops terms, yes, it is. Simple as that. Black and white. It is faster. You can actually calculate this yourself. The CUDA cores of the Tegra 1 run at, we believe, 950 megahertz. So it has to be, considering that's the figure that Nvidia are using anyway. So if you take 192 times 2, which is the amount of flops per CUDA core can process per clock, so then you take 192 times by 2, then you times that by 950, you get the 365 G-flops. That, don't worry about rewinding that. I've got it on the article, so you just read that. Which is definitely higher than the PS3 or Xbox 360. The Xbox 360 weighs in, for example, at 240. So yes, it's higher. There are some caveats. The Tegra K1 has less ROPs, fewer ROPs, but they're offset by a higher clock frequency. Nvidia's putting, for example, the fill rate in terms of G-texels at 7.6. I have got the math, by the way, in the article, which shows you how to calculate that. But this is offset by the fact that they've got less memory bandwidth. They've got 17. Sorry guys, still suffering a little bit from a sore throat, but I'm getting better. So that's less memory bandwidth. That's a lot less memory bandwidth than, for example, the Xbox 360. But there's also a far larger amount of memory available. For example, with the 360, you look at it, 512 megabytes. The Tegra has 2 gigabytes plus. For example, one of the models they shown was 4 with a tablet. So that's a good thing for graphics, yeah? It starts to get a bit trickier when you start looking at CPU performance. Because they're being a little bit unfair for the PS3, because they've basically not taken into account the SPUs inside the machine, which is a little bit harsh, and they actually give a lot of performance, but whatever. Even so, the fact of the matter is, it's a little bit debatable. Now, Nvidia have already shown the Tegra running, and I do literally mean this. There's videos floating about that show the Tegra running Serious Sam, running the Unreal Engine 4. You know, that's a given. It's done. It's not like a debate. And Nvidia, as I said, are running this with DX11, and they are actually, it's 11.2 technically, but who's counting? And they are also very proud to say that this means that we can port games from the desktop, high-end desktops, to the Tegra. A lot of this really depends on your perspective. Now, there are some points. For example, you can easily, on a lot of these games, you can easily tone down the detail. Yeah, the engines are very flexible like that. And I don't think anyone who's got reasonable expectations is going to assume that a GPU, for example, the GTX 780 Ti, let's just use that, which costs, you know, several £100, is going to, and features like, you know, almost 3,000 of these CUDA cores, is going to be able to put up, it's just going to trounce the K1. I don't think anyone with reasonable expectations assumes differently. But what that Nvidia are stating is that it will allow developers to say, okay, well, this version is for the PS4 and the Xbox One and the high-end PCs. This version is going to be for the Tegra. And what will likely happen, and this is me theorizing here, this has not been confirmed, but what will likely happen is they're going to be doing this via reducing post-processing. So we're not going to be seeing like super duper high levels of AA. You know, we're not going to be seeing like MSAA times 4 or something. We're also not going to be seeing super duper high resolution textures. We're definitely going to be seeing less complicated lighting effects, and we're going to certainly be seeing less things which require compute, because obviously that can be very expensive. So compute shaders, that type of thing, will likely be toned down. HBAO, physical based lighting, anything that's really going to be taxing, that might take a hit. What is probably going to stay, though, is the basic essence of the game. And is it going to look better than a PS3 title? Well, it's hard to say. Definitely in terms of some respect, probably. It certainly has more memory. It could probably process larger scenes because of that. In other words, more stuff that can fit in the world. We're not sure about overheads yet. It is using the Android 4.4, I think, operating system. That's completely from the top of my head. So in those ways, you know, it's a good thing. I don't think we're not going to be seeing situations where it's going to compete with high-end desktops. I don't think that's a realistic expectation from anyone. But what we are going to be seeing is situations where we're going to be seeing ports of games that are either very toned down, or we're going to be seeing versions of games on that, for example, were able to be played on the Xbox 360 or PS3. Those could certainly be ported, and so on. So there's definitely a lot of potential there. It's also worth remembering that DX11, some of the effects on DX11, which of course this supports, aren't necessarily more expensive, and sometimes they're actually better. They're actually more efficient than DX9. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Obviously, it's been a bit of an interesting one, but don't forget, guys, I've recently just had an interview with AMD, and I'm also working on a few other interviews right now, so hopefully you'll stick with us. But I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.